think the most common money story that we see is rich people are evil, or money is the root of all evil, or something along these lines, right? That having wealth makes you a bad person. And this is one of the oldest and greatest money stories ever told, right? Like we see references in religious texts thousands and thousands of years ago about rich people being evil. So if we grow up with this idea that rich people are evil, that they must have exploited someone to get their money, that they don't care about the poor, or that they're selfish, like all of these things are ingrained in our society. So what happens is, as we grow up and then as we become more successful ourselves, we'll actually start to self-sabotage. Because for example, if I grew up listening to my dad every night rail against rich people at the dinner table and how evil they were, if I end up starting a company and start to accumulate wealth, my subconscious will actually do anything in order to avoid being labeled as evil by my dad. Like, I am trying to escape judgment from my dad. Now, I don't know that I'm doing this on a conscious level, but the way this manifests is like me, like emptying my bank account as soon as money would hit it, right? Because there's this subconscious idea that if I start to accumulate a great amount of wealth, my friends are going to judge me, my family's going to judge me, like people around me are going to leave me, they're going to think I'm selfish. And so that results in self-sabotaging behavior unless we can kind of identify where those things came from and reframe back to neutral. As we said, remove that emotion.
Yeah. So that's money story number one, that too much money is evil. And the way that kind of works is that we all have our preferences, our subconscious preferences. And most of us prefer to be loved by our tribe than make more money. So if we think we're at risk of being loved by our tribe because we're going to make a lot of money, we make ourselves poor in a way in order to not lose that love. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and it may not. All of these exist on a spectrum, so it may not result in emptying our bank accounts and going back to poverty in this extreme example. But one way it definitely shows up is don't be too showy. If you're showing off your money, you're rubbing poor people's face in it. These kind of things. So there is this really strong drive by society to kind of stay inside the lines and make sure that you're not going off into territory that's going to make others uncomfortable. And so that's where this rich people are evil comes from, is like, hey, we want you to be successful, but not too successful, because that's going to start making other people uncomfortable.
Question for you, because what you're saying here is an example that, for your example, that you got really successful and then you didn't feel comfortable with that level of success. What I've also seen with a lot of entrepreneurs is that they actually stop themselves from getting successful. Is that the same angle, so to speak, but just people take it differently, so to speak? Why do you think that is, that you gave yourself permission to find success, but then weren't comfortable with it? And some people don't even give themselves permission to find that success. Like, what's the differentiator?
So it's a great question. And I think one of the core drivers that we have to work through with entrepreneurs, because we'll only ever allow ourselves to be as successful as we feel we deserve. And that might be different for everybody. And these different money stories contribute to how much success is enough, right? And so all of us at some point will typically bump up against that limitation. For somebody, it might be $1 million. For somebody else, it might be $100 million. But at some point, these are going to start rearing their ugly head. And again, based on how we were raised, or what our parents were talking about and how they related to money, that's going to start manifesting. And they also fall into different categories. So when you talk about money is evil, or rich people are evil, that's kind of a guilt or a deserving or worthiness type story. And another one is, I don't deserve what I have. And this really comes from people who grow up with wealth or inherit wealth relative to those around them. So what happens is, imagine, and I spoke to a client recently who grew up in a relatively poor country, and his parents were relatively well off, compared to those around them. Yeah. So they had servants, they had a lot of help. And at 6 years old, he's looking around, he's seeing, the kids of the servants versus his life. And he realizes there's this distinct difference in how they're being treated. And his child brain is going, well, I didn't do anything different than that. Right? Like at 6 years old, you don't understand what the difference is or where this came from. And so that's the beginning of this guilt of, I don't deserve this money. And so that's why we see a lot of self-sabotaging behavior come from like second or third generation wealth. If they feel that, they didn't do anything to earn the money, or, another one, work hard and you'll be successful. Like, anything worth having is worth working hard for, right? Well, if they didn't work hard for their money, now we don't deserve that money, right? Yeah. And what's interesting is that some of these are true, right? Like, so you are going to feel judgment if you inherit a lot of money from society. Like people don't like that. Like
they're envious.
Exactly. So some of these are actually real. Some of them are manufactured by the subconscious, but some of these actually do exist, and we have to figure out how to navigate this.
Yeah. This is really interesting because, like, as you know, I used to work as the head of security for a billionaire. So I spent a lot of time in Monaco, in St. Barth, and all these really, really, really wealthy areas, like the most wealthy areas in the world. And I would see so many of the kids, they would just be trying to do anything to escape their lives, whether it's drugs, drinking, or whatever it may be. And I didn't understand that at the time because they didn't have that emotional lexicon, but they were just trying to find a way to blunt that feeling of guilt. Like, how can I escape from this emotion? And It was so visible that, like, they don't like, something feels off, so they have to posture. They were very, like, nobody there seemed relaxed. They were very on edge, and there was so much drugs and so much drinking because they just wanted to run away from how they felt about themselves.
Yeah, and it makes sense, right? Like, when I talk about this, a lot of times people are like, "Oh, boo-hoo, poor rich kid," but like, that's a real problem. You're born into this thing that you didn't ask for, and now everywhere you go. So here's a great example. I was running one of my retreats, and we're talking about money stories, and there's a girl who goes, "Yeah, but what about Kylie Jenner? Like, Kylie Jenner just burns me up, right? Like, she's on the cover of all these magazines as a self-made billionaire. There's nothing self-made about Kylie Jenner. Like, everything she has is because of her family. And that just pisses me off because I've had to work for everything that I have." And I was like, whoa, okay. Well, let me ask you a question. Right? Okay. Yeah, we have these intense reactions. And so, okay, what would she have had to do to deserve that money? And she thought about it for a little while. She said nothing. Nothing that she could do to deserve it. And then I asked her another question, which is, what would you have to do to deserve that amount of money? And there was just silence. And then I'm telling this story to another client a few weeks later, and I tell him, I get to the part about Kylie Jenner and how there's nothing that she could do to deserve that money. And he says, I felt that every single day in my life. Because this client was the son of a billionaire, and he had taken what he inherited from his family, and he had generated a massive amount of returns with that money. He worked in private equity. He was on fund number 4, 9 figures, 10 figures of profits, return on assets, working 80, 100-hour weeks for years on end. He was completely burnt out. And the reason he was doing all of that was because every day he could feel the judgment of every person around him, but there was nothing he could do to earn that money. And so, I asked him, if you couldn't do what you're doing now, what would you do? And he had this whole life planned out. He was going to move to his ranch and ride horses with his kids and all of this stuff. He was only in this whole world of private equity and building these massive funds because he felt this heavy weight since he was a kid. Right? And
you need to disprove it in some way, basically, to himself, to others, whatever it may be.
Right? And it's really difficult to put ourselves in that position if we weren't raised in that position. But what I've really found is, like, what a weight, what a heaviness to be born with is something that you didn't ask for.